I work at a facility that contains gods. Or maybe contains isn't the right word. You can't really contain something that existed before the concept of walls. Something that remembers the first fire, the first prayer, the first human who begged for mercy. We don't have an official name. At least, not one we're allowed to use. Everyone just calls it CSP. Chain, Seal, Protect. That's our motto, our purpose. And before you ask, no, I am pretty sure you've never heard of us. Nobody has. We don't even appear on government records, maps, or budgets. If we do our job correctly, the world never learns we exist. I'm posting this because I don't think anyone will believe me anyway. Well, that, and I've decided to start journaling. Apparently, it's supposed to be healthy. Helps you process your thoughts, organize your feelings, and all that nonsense. But journaling into a notebook sounds boring as hell. No offense to the suburban moms who write 3 pages every morning about their yoga classes and pumpkin spice lattes. But if I'm going to write about my day, I want an audience. And trust me, my days are worth reading about. I love this job. That's probably the weirdest thing you'll hear in this entire story. Most stories like this start with someone who hates their job. They're trapped, desperate, forced into it somehow. That's not me. Okay, that's only partially true. I wasn't exactly forced to join CSP, but they didn't give me many alternatives either. The way they recruit people is actually kind of genius. They don't look for the best candidates. They don't look for the smartest people, the strongest people, or even the most qualified. They look for people who are already half dead, people with no future, people with no family, people nobody would miss. That's what I mean when I say half dead. You're not actually dead, your heart still beats, you still wake up every morning, but your existence has already faded from the world. Nobody calls, nobody checks in, nobody notices when you're gone for a week, or a month, or forever. You've already been forgotten, so you might as well be halfway in the grave. That's the kind of people CSP recruits. Because when you work at a facility dedicated to chaining, sealing, and protecting things that shouldn't exist, employee retention isn't exactly great. And if one of us dies, well, it's easier when nobody comes looking. Well, I wasn't always half dead. I had a family once. Not a good one, but a family. Getting into the details would take an entire post and probably trigger another mental breakdown, so let's skip the trauma dump. All I'll say is that I left, and I never looked back, and as far as I'm concerned, even if they all perished, it isn't my problem. After I left, things got worse. I hit rock bottom, tried to end it all, and then ended up under state supervision. Officially, they called it counseling. Mandatory sessions, evaluations, therapists asking the same questions in different ways, hoping I'd eventually give them the answer they wanted. It didn't work. Mostly because I lied through every session. At least, I thought it was counseling. Turns out it was recruitment. A few weeks after my treatment ended, I was taken. Kidnapped is probably the correct word, though CSP would likely prefer something cleaner, like acquisition or transfer. I woke up in a concrete holding cell with no windows, no clock, and a single metal table. There was a glass vial sitting on it. Across from me sat a man in a gray suit. He gave me 2 options. The first was simple. Drink the vial, a painless death. Quick, clean, guaranteed. The second was employment. Join the facility. At the time, I thought it was some kind of sick joke. Then he explained what CSP actually was, and that's when I learned the real reason nobody knows about the organization, because once you know it exists, you don't get to leave. You either become part of the facility, or you never leave at all. And despite what you might be thinking, I didn't choose the vial. Funny how that works. You can spend years wanting to die, convinced there's nothing left for you, and then the moment someone gives you a reason to keep going, suddenly death doesn't seem so appealing anymore. Or maybe it wasn't the purpose. Maybe it was pure spite. Part of me wanted to outlive my parents, to keep breathing long enough to know I'll never attend their funerals. Whatever the reason, I signed the contract. That was 2 years ago. Since then, I've been promoted 3 times. Not because I'm exceptional, not because I'm some genius monster hunter or elite operative. I'm just the only idiot left alive to promote. Most of my coworkers are fresh recruits. Every few months, a new batch arrives, looking confused, terrified, or numb. Some think they've joined a secret government agency. Some think they're being punished. A few are actually excited. Those are usually the first ones to die. Out of every 500 recruits, maybe 15 make it past their first year. Of those 15, maybe 5 survive their second. After that, the numbers get so small nobody bothers tracking them. So either I'm incredibly lucky, or I'm like a cockroach. Ugly, stubborn, and impossible to kill. Personally, I'm betting on the cockroach theory. Before I tell you what happened last week, you need to understand how gods actually work. First, CSP doesn't imprison gods. That's a common misconception. Humans are incapable of imprisoning a god. Trust me, we've tried. When we say a god is contained, what we really mean is that it's being managed, kept satisfied, kept predictable, kept from wandering off and collecting worshippers on its own. How the containment division accomplishes that is beyond me. I work in retrieval, not containment, and I have no interest in transferring. The mortality rate over there makes our department look like a retirement home. I'm one of the 3 heads of the retrieval division. One of the other managers has survived 4 years. The third has survived 3, which basically means they're better cockroaches than I am. Our job is simple in theory. Find newly emerged gods, negotiate with them, offer them a deal, a place to stay, worshippers, protection from rival entities and human interference. In exchange, they stop kidnapping people. Most gods don't want to destroy humanity, they just want attention. The problem is that gods attract worship the same way a fire attracts moths. Lost people, lonely people, desperate people. A god will whisper into their dreams, promise them purpose, and before long they're gone. That's why whenever you see a cluster of mysterious disappearances, odds are good a god is involved. Gods are classified by the number of active worshippers they possess. D class, 500 to 1,000 worshippers. C class, 1,000 to 5,000. B class, 5,000 to 10,000. A class, 10,000 to 20,000. Anything above 20,000 is considered S class. Anything above 500,000 becomes SS class. And anything beyond that, well, humanity stops pretending that it can control it. At CSP, we currently house 2 S-class entities and a single SS class. The lower classes are so numerous that nobody bothers counting them anymore. Anyway, the reason I'm journaling all this is because my therapist won't stop bothering me. Surprisingly, CSP has its own mental health department now, which is honestly more terrifying than most of the gods. Every month, they drag me into an office, ask me how I'm feeling, and pretend they're surprised when I tell them I'm feeling terrible. Apparently, surviving 2 years in retrieval isn't normal, and the fact that I can casually eat lunch while discussing casualty reports is a sign that I've developed unhealthy coping mechanisms. Their words, not mine. So this is my compromise. I'm not writing in a notebook like some depressed Victorian poet. I'm putting everything here instead. If nothing else, maybe it'll save the next poor idiot who gets recruited. Or maybe it'll just give future psychologists more material to argue about after I inevitably die. Either way, everyone wins. Now let's get to the reason I'm writing this in the first place, with what happened a few hours ago. A new assignment came across our desk. People were disappearing in the Sahara Desert. Now normally, that wouldn't raise any alarms. Hundreds of people vanish in the Sahara every year. The desert is massive, unforgiving, and very good at hiding bodies. What caught our attention was the increase. Normally, the annual number sits somewhere between 250 and 500 disappearances. Last year, it hit 600. This year, it had already reached 700, and we weren't even halfway through the year. Something was taking them, which usually means a new god has appeared. Our team was dispatched immediately. Unfortunately, I had another problem. I needed a new assistant. Again. I really need a new assistant, Jacob, I said. Well, Jacob is one of the other two cockroaches. Managers, I mean. And his name isn't actually Jacob. Neither of us use our real names here. CSP is very particular about keeping our identities separate from the organization. The fewer connections there are between your real life and this place, the better. If something gets out, nobody can trace you back to the facility, or the facility back to you. Mine isn't either. I named myself after a hair shampoo I used as a kid. Don't ask me why. It was the first thing that came to mind when they asked what name I wanted on file. Jacob looked up from his paperwork and sighed. No. No? No. And why is that? Because this is your 20th assistant this year. I pointed a finger at him. That statistic is incredibly misleading. How? Because it implies I killed them. Jacob stared at me. I stared back. Fine, I said. Most of them died on my missions. Exactly. It's not my fault the recruits keep dying. I'm not their mother. That's probably what worries me. I glanced at the dock. 10 minutes until departure. If I missed the helicopter, Jeff would leave without me. The pilot already hated me for reasons that may or may not involve an incident with an ancient fertility god and a fuel truck. Please, Jacob groaned. Fine, take Sean. A young man sitting nearby immediately looked horrified. Jacob shoved him toward me. He's from my division. If he dies, Nairi, I'm not giving you another assistant. Deal. I left before he could change his mind. Sean hurried after me toward the helipad. The poor guy looked like he was walking toward his execution. Statistically speaking, he kind of was. My retrieval team consists of 56 people. 7 are part of the command team. Myself, Sean, and 5 senior operatives responsible for actually negotiating with gods. The remaining personnel are security. Their job is simple. Get us to the god alive. Keep us alive while we negotiate. And get us back alive afterward. On paper, it sounds easy. In reality, it's usually the hardest part. We arrived at the Giza Pyramid. Normally this place is packed with tourists, but not today. Our team had the site shut down under the guise of renovations. We entered through a route the public doesn't know about. Not the path that leads up into the pyramid, but the one that descends beneath it. The ancient Egyptians were remarkable builders. Unfortunately, something had decided to use their masterpiece as a feeding ground. We encountered the first layer of worshippers near the entrance. They moved wrong. One man had both of his legs bent in directions. Legs aren't supposed to bend. Yet he sprinted toward us anyway. Another dragged himself forward with a broken spine. The security detail opened fire. 10 bodies hit the floor before they got close. We pushed deeper into the tunnels. The second layer was worse. 50, maybe 60 worshippers rushed us at once. Some crawled across the walls and ceiling like insects. One dropped directly in front of me before Elena, my security captain, put a bullet through its skull. Another came from above. I shot it in the head, and it landed at my feet. "Move!" I shouted. We ran. The third layer was the last known layer, and that's where we found the god. It resembled a massive stone statue stretching from floor to ceiling like a trunk of gigantic tree. Thousands of worshippers circled it in endless loops, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. I locked eyes with one of them. The problem was, it didn't have any. Only empty sockets stared back at me. The instant it spotted us, a gurgling screech erupted from its throat. a sound so wrong it barely resembled anything human. Then every worshipper in the chamber began screeching. Thousands of voices echoed through the cavern. "Greetings, my lord," I said, stepping forward. The intelligence briefing had classified it as a C class. It wasn't. Not even close. The thing was at least A class, which was a problem because I had brought a C class team. "Greetings, my lord," I repeated. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a voice whispered directly into my ear. "Lowly human." I resisted the urge to jump. The thing was at least 50 feet away. "What brings you to my sanctuary, human?" it asked. "We represent an organization dedicated to assisting divine entities." The lie rolled off my tongue so smoothly, I almost impressed myself. Still, peaceful containment beats becoming toast. "Assisting?" The god stared at me. "And why would a god such as myself require assistance from lowly humans?" "Because, my lord, people are going to stop coming here." The god tilted its stone head. "And why is that?" "The pyramid is being renovated. Humans won't be allowed inside it for a long time." The god's stone face twisted. Its worshippers began to twitch. "No pilgrims?" "Not for some time." "No wanderers?" "No." "No offerings?" "No." The god's voice sharpened with every question. Then it shrieked. Thousands of worshippers turned toward us at once. Gods are prideful creatures. Deny them admiration for even a single day, and it wounds their ego. Tell them new worshippers will stop coming altogether, and the reaction is rarely pleasant. I cleared my throat. "This is why we're here, to provide assistance during this unfortunate period." The god fell silent. "Continue." The statue leaned forward, its massive face stopping only a few feet from mine. I could smell incense, blood, and something far older than either. "We can provide housing, worshippers, protection, maintenance, and a stable source of followers." "What makes you think I will believe you, little human?" I gestured toward the empty entrance. "Today's visitor count?" The god didn't respond. "0 worshippers arrived today." Still nothing. "And tomorrow won't be much better." The statue slowly straightened. I could practically hear it thinking, which was terrifying. God's thinking is usually bad for humans. "And what would you demand in return?" it finally asked. "Very little. Nothing is ever little with humans." "Fair." The worshippers resumed their circling, their feet scraping softly against the ancient stone as they moved. I reached into my bag and removed the sealed scroll. "We've prepared a formal proposal." Before the god could respond, I handed it to Sean and shoved him forward. "Huh?" was all Sean managed to say before he stumbled into one of the worshippers. Several of them immediately grabbed him and dragged him toward the statue while he screamed. The scroll floated from his hands before it reached the ground. The god read it. I have no idea what was written on it. Nobody in Retrieval does. The scrolls arrive sealed from the containment division. They're written in some ancient language only gods can understand. We aren't allowed to open them. Rumor says reading one drives humans insane, and I've never been curious enough to test that theory. "Quite a proposition, lowly creature," the god snarled. For a moment, I thought it was going to reject the offer. Then it laughed. "I accept." And with that, a blinding light filled the chamber, causing all of us to close our eyes. When I opened my eyes, the statue was gone. The worshippers were gone. The cavern was empty. Another successful mission. We returned to the helicopter. I was halfway on board when I realized Sean wasn't with us. I looked around, counted heads, counted again. Still no Sean. I sighed. "Sorry, Jacob." I already knew he was going to kill me. Not literally, probably, but it wasn't my fault. The god had decided to keep him. The entity now resides on the 44th floor of the facility under a long-term containment agreement. Sean lives there too. He's one of the worshippers now. Last I heard, he spends his days walking in circles and chanting in a language nobody understands. Officially, he's listed as alive. Personally, I think that's debatable. Still, that's not what has me irritated. What has me irritated is what was waiting for me when I got back. A new assignment. Apparently, while we were dealing with the pyramid, something showed up in Antarctica. Normally, that wouldn't be my problem. Antarctica is usually containment's territory. If something decides to crawl out of the ice, they can be the one to deal with it. Unfortunately, somebody upstairs disagreed. The report was thin. Too thin. Just 3 pages. A satellite image, a casualty estimate, and a single sentence highlighted in red. Possible divine emergence confirmed. Retrieval team required immediately. I remember staring at that sentence for a long time. Not because of the assignment, not because of the location, because of the casualty estimate. The last team that went there was erased, never to be seen again. It was a containment division team, and apparently, just because I was a 100% success rate, the people upstairs think this is something I can handle. Side note, I can't. The previous team vanished into thin air, never to be seen again, which means whatever we're going to find in Antarctica already has them. And if that's the case, there's a decent chance my next assistant won't be the only one who dies. Honestly, I should probably get some sleep before we leave. The helicopter departs at 6, so 8 hours from now. At least that means Jacob won't get the chance to kill me. By the time he receives the report, I will be long gone. Antarctica is waiting, and for the first time in a long time, I'm not looking forward to a mission. Part 2. So I got a new boss. Well, got is a crazy way to put it. Forced into the arrangement is probably more accurate. I have a lot of feelings about the situation, and unfortunately, most of them are terrible. The rest are alcohol related. So this feels like the perfect time to sit down and write everything out before I convince myself none of it actually happened. The short version is that Antarctica went very, very wrong. The slightly longer version is that over 10,000 civilians disappeared. 405 containment personnel vanished trying to investigate, and for reasons that still escape me, management decided I was the right person to send after them. Apparently surviving previous deadly encounters qualifies you for future deadly encounters. Human resources should really stop using that metric. To explain how any of that led to my current employment situation, we need to go back a few hours, to the moment a casualty report landed on my desk. Missing. Containment Division personnel, 405. Civilians, over 10,000. I stared at the report. 10,000 civilians was tragic. 405 containment personnel was a staffing problem. Before you judge me, understand that these numbers directly affect my workload. According to the file, scientists stationed throughout Antarctica had been disappearing for the past 3 months. In the first month, 3 entire research stations were abandoned. One moment, they were there. The next, they weren't. No distress calls, no evacuation requests, no bodies, just empty facilities and missing personnel. In the second month, 4 more stations vanished. The third month, 5. This month wasn't even halfway over yet, and 2 more stations had already gone silent. That was why containment responded so quickly. Normally, Antarctica buys you time. The continent is cold, remote, miserable, and generally hostile to human life. Emergency responses aren't exactly convenient, but when entire research stations start evaporating off the face of the planet, people suddenly become very motivated. A containment division task force was dispatched almost immediately. 405 personnel, every single one disappeared. I was lucky I'd been in Egypt. Otherwise, that would have been my team, and somehow, I don't think I'd be reading this report right now. I would have been part of it. There are only a few things capable of making an entire containment division team disappear without leaving behind a single body, an SS-class entity, another containment division team, or Antarctica itself. Honestly, Antarctica had the highest kill count out of all three. People romanticize the place because it's covered in snow. In reality, it's an enormous frozen death trap that occasionally allows scientists to visit before trying to kill them. You fall into a crevice, you're gone. A blizzard rolls in, you're gone. You take one bad step in the wrong direction, congratulations, you're now part of the landscape. Unfortunately, my money wasn't on Antarctica. Something was down there. Something powerful enough to erase entire facilities. Maybe a god. Maybe something worse. Maybe something even the CSP didn't know. As ridiculous as that sounds, several incidents over the last 3 months suggested CSP wasn't nearly as informed as it liked to pretend. Gods had started disappearing from containment. Not escaping, disappearing. One day they'd be present, the next they'd be gone. Days or weeks later, they'd casually return as if nothing had happened. Whenever they were questioned, the answer was always the same. We had offerings to make. That was it. No explanations, no details. The lack of answers wasn't unusual. Most gods barely acknowledge that humanity exists. Talking to one is like trying to interview a hurricane. They generally don't care what you think and have no interest in explaining themselves. The only exception was a river god Jacob's team had recovered from the Amazon last spring. The thing loved hearing itself talk. Most gods treated interviews like talking to ants. It treated them like podcast appearances. When asked where the others were going, it gave us exactly one answer. The one with wings and a million seekers calls upon us. Then it refused to elaborate. Containment had dismissed the statement. I didn't, because I noticed patterns. Over 3 months, 10,000 civilians had vanished. Hundreds of personnel had disappeared, and gods were leaving containment facilities for mysterious gatherings. Either the universe was experiencing the world's strangest coincidence, or something beneath Antarctica was powerful enough to summon gods. Neither possibility improved my day. I had 6 hours before departure, so I headed for the library. The library wasn't actually a library. Calling it a library would be like calling a nuclear weapon a flashlight. Technically not wrong, but missing several important details. Over a century ago, CSP made a deal with a god living somewhere in the Himalayas. The arrangement was simple. It would provide a fraction of its knowledge in exchange for access to information twice every 100 years. Most people considered it one of the worst deals humanity has ever made. Personally, I thought those people were idiots. Most of CSP's understanding of the Celestial came from deals exactly like this. Besides, from what I understood, the exchange benefited us far more than the god. Imagine spending 5 minutes talking to an ant colony and giving it centuries of your accumulated knowledge in return. That's basically what happened. The god got a conversation. Humanity got a shortcut through several thousand years of trial and error. After a few hours of searching, I focused on the statement from the Amazon god. The one with wings and a million seekers calls upon us. The library returned no results. That got my attention. The 44 floors of information never return 0 results. Ever. Everything leaves a trail, especially gods. They're far too arrogant to hide it. If they could, they'd write their names across the moon and expect humanity to thank them for the view. I tried searching for winged gods instead. Thousands of entities appeared for winged entities, but none matched. The more I thought about it, the less sense the description made. Gods don't have wings. Not real ones. Their forms exist for accessibility. They need followers. They need worshippers. Floating permanently above humanity would be the supernatural equivalent of opening a restaurant in the middle of the ocean. That's when I realized the thing being described probably wasn't a god. Unfortunately, that realization only led me to something worse. One of the historical texts contained a section titled Origins. According to the book, the gods hadn't simply appeared, they had been created. One passage immediately caught my attention. The makers descended from heaven and raised the first gods from among lesser beings. I'd never heard the term before. Makers. The chapter provided almost no explanation before abruptly ending. Another book mentioned 3 objects descending into Antarctica thousands of years before recorded civilization. They weren't meteors. They didn't leave craters. The illustration on the next page nearly made me drop the book. 3 winged figures emerged from the ice. Their bodies were covered in eyes. Millions of eyes. My stomach dropped as the Amazon god statement echoed through my head. Not seekers. Eyes. The translation had been wrong, or perhaps the god had intentionally used a word that meant both. The beings in the history books had a name. Angels. When I searched the library database for them, only a single result appeared. 1 page. The library contained millions of books and somehow only possessed a single page about angels. That terrified me more than anything I'd read all day, because it meant somebody had gone out of their way to erase them from history. According to the document, angels existed before the gods. They had been created directly by the Creator and originally maintained reality itself. But then they got bored. I stared at the sentence for several seconds. Bored. The document compared their behavior to humanity. We were supposed to protect the world, yet we'd spent most of our existence damaging it. According to the page, angels weren't much different. After existing for millions, or perhaps billions of years, they simply stopped caring. They lost interest in reality, lost interest in purpose, lost interest in everything. Somewhere along the way, they started creating gods, not because they needed to, but because they were bored. And apparently, cosmic beings are just as capable of making terrible decisions as everyone else. This was insane. CSP barely possessed the resources necessary to manage some gods. Several entities remained cooperative solely because they felt like it. An angel? One of the original 3? Forget containing it. We probably couldn't even annoy it. If what I'd read was true, then Antarctica wasn't dealing with an SS-class entity. We were dealing with something far older, far more powerful, something that gods themselves answered to. I glanced at the clock. 3 hours until departure. There was no way in hell I was keeping this to myself. I folded the page and headed for the elevators. The board of directors occupied the 102nd floor. Most personnel never set foot there. The directors were usually too busy to meet without weeks of scheduling and enough paperwork to kill a small forest. I didn't have weeks. I barely had 3 hours. By the time the elevator doors opened, I was practically jogging. Most of the directors were off-site, which left me with exactly one option: Mr. Stonehill. Unfortunately, Stonehill sat above the head of containment and held a permanent seat on the board. He was also a snob, though that hardly made him unique among upper management. I knocked once. "Come in." The door slid open. Stonehill looked exactly as he always did, like a snake that had somehow learned how to wear a suit. I placed the page on his desk. "Sir, I think I've found something connected to Antarctica." I explained everything: the disappearances, the gods, the books, the angels. When I finished, he glanced at the page and sighed. The facility already knows about angels. I felt irrationally offended. I'd spent hours discovering information he apparently already had sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere. "Then you know what's beneath Antarctica?" "No." The answer came immediately. Because if an angel were involved, none of this would be happening. I frowned. Stonehill leaned back in his chair. Gods care about followers. Angels don't. They existed long before gods, humanity, and civilization. They do not need worshippers. No need for sacrifices. No need for attention. He shrugged. 10,000 missing humans would mean nothing to them. I looked down at the page. The Amazon gods said they were being called. Gods say many things. I hated that answer. Then what's happening? The entity is gathering followers. His expression hardened. And every hour we waste debating it increases the body count. I stared at him for a moment before asking the question that had been bothering me since I entered the office. How do we know it's gathering followers? I asked. What if it's just killing people because it wants to? That actually got his attention. For several seconds he considered the question before shaking his head. If something powerful enough to erase 400 personnel killed purely for amusement, humanity would have disappeared long ago. I hated that answer. Unfortunately, hating it wasn't going to buy me any extra time. Before I could argue, the office door opened. Stonehill's assistant stepped inside. Sir, transport is ready. Stonehill nodded, then looked at me. The conversation was over. Your aircraft leaves in less than 2 hours, Miss Nyeri. I grabbed the page from his desk. Stonehill had already gone back to his paperwork. As far as he was concerned, Antarctica contained another god, another mission, another problem. Nothing more. I knew the CSP viewed personnel as grains of salt, so his indifference didn't surprise me at all. We reached Antarctica surprisingly quickly. The aircraft was mostly automated, which wasn't standard for CSP operations. They usually insisted on keeping a pilot on board. This time they didn't. Personally, I figured it was because if all 800 of us vanished, they'd still be able to recover the plane. The CSP loves cutting costs, which is funny considering none of us get paid. People hear secret government organization and imagine unlimited budgets. The reality is less glamorous. We live in CSP facilities, eat CSP food, wear CSP uniforms, and usually die before retirement. For the few who somehow survive long enough to retire, there is a pension waiting for them. Most never get the chance to collect it. On the bright side, healthcare is free, so I try not to complain too much. The automated aircraft landed roughly 2 miles from the anomaly. 800 security personnel accompanied me. My negotiation team consisted of 20 specialists selected from various departments. Normally, I'd also have an assistant. Unfortunately, my last assistant is technically still classified as alive, so I don't qualify for a new one. We approached the entrance of a massive ice cave carved deep into the Antarctic shelf. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The tunnel descended in layers, each one deeper than the last. We passed the first level, then the second, third, fourth. Nothing. By the time we reached the 6th level, several members of the team were visibly relaxing. I wasn't. Something had erased 405 containment personnel. It was here. We simply hadn't found it yet. Then we reached the 7th level, and everything changed. The cold didn't bother me much. Our suits were designed for Antarctic deployment and could withstand temperatures that would have killed an unprotected human in minutes. What I saw did. The walls were covered in bodies. Thousands of them. Frozen men and women embedded directly into the ice. Scientists, containment personnel, civilians. Some looked terrified. Others appeared completely calm, as if they'd simply stopped moving and frozen where they stood. The tunnel stretched ahead for miles, and every inch of it was lined with human beings. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. I stared at the frozen faces surrounding us, then into the darkness waiting ahead. This was bad. So unbelievably bad. Because I finally knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a god. Gods need followers. They need worshippers. They need people they can influence, manipulate, and communicate with. Freezing thousands of humans inside a glacier where probably nobody could ever reach them served no purpose. We continued downward. Level 8, level 9, level 10. The bodies never stopped. The deeper we went, the older they became. Scientists gave way to explorers. Explorers gave way to soldiers. Soldiers gave way to people wearing clothing from civilizations that should not have existed. Some of the corpses looked thousands of years old, yet somehow remained perfectly preserved, as if the ice itself refused to let them decay. By the time we reached the bottom, nobody was speaking anymore. At the center of the cavern stood something larger than a mountain, a winged figure covered in eyes. Millions of them. Chains wrapped around its body and disappeared into the ice. For one brief, glorious moment, I thought it might actually be imprisoned. Then I noticed the chains. They were divine. The same material found within gods. The realization hit immediately. The gods hadn't worshipped this thing. They'd chained it. A loud crack echoed through the cavern. One chain snapped. Then another. Then thousands of eyes opened. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even move. The light pouring from the angel's countless eyes was so bright that I instinctively shut my own. For several seconds I remained frozen in place. Then I heard the commotion around me. Some people were laughing. Others were crying. A few had fallen to their knees and started praying. Several were screaming for everyone to open their eyes, while others couldn't stop talking about how beautiful it was. Then came the running, the screaming, the gunfire, and the sounds of hundreds of trained personnel completely losing their minds. I didn't need to see what was happening, and I refused to die like this. Think, Naeri, think. Then an idea came to me. I know where the gods are. The cavern fell silent. Even the screams stopped. My heart nearly exploded. I swallowed hard and repeated myself louder. I know where the gods are. A sound echoed throughout the cavern. Laughter. Not human laughter. Something deeper, older. The laughter of a creature that had watched continents form and civilizations turn to dust. A mere human bargains for her life. The angel sounded genuinely amused. You are quite entertaining. I forced myself to keep talking. If it was speaking, it wasn't killing. At the moment, that was good enough for me. Weren't they the ones who trapped you here? The laughter grew louder. You believe they trapped me? You believe chains can imprison me? For the first time, I risked opening my eyes. I immediately regretted it. Millions of eyes stared back. Every single one focused on me. I remained because I wished to remain. The angel shifted one of its wings and the entire cavern trembled. Chunks of ice broke from the ceiling and crashed into the darkness below. The gods occasionally gather and strengthen the chains. They imagine themselves powerful enough to contain me. The laughter returned. I find the spectacle entertaining. It relieves my boredom. I looked around. People were still disappearing. Others continued walking toward the angel despite every survival instinct screaming at them to run. This thing wasn't trapped. We were the ones imprisoned with it. Then the angel's attention settled on me once more. The cavern became silent, but human. Millions of eyes narrowed. What will you offer to relieve my boredom? I had a feeling there wasn't a correct answer to that question. There were only disappointing ones, so I did the only thing I could think of. I told the truth. I belong to an organization that houses gods. Its purpose is to keep them in check. For a moment there was silence. Then the angel laughed harder than before. The cavern shook violently. Entire sections of ice collapsed. Thousands of frozen corpses shattered against the floor like glass. Humans keeping gods in check? It laughed again. Now that is genuinely intriguing. Then the laughter stopped instantly. Millions of eyes focused on me. Perhaps, the angel said, my eternity has finally become interesting. The chains rattled. Cracks spread across them like spiderwebs as the cavern shook around us. People screamed while ice collapsed from the ceiling. I looked around desperately. 800 personnel, 20 negotiations, thousands of frozen corpses. Humanity's greatest containment organization. And none of it mattered. Then the angel made me an offer. Promise to relieve my boredom, and I may continue tolerating humanity. May, not will. May. The kind of wording lawyers and supernatural horrors absolutely love. Around me, people continued dying. 800 soldiers, 20 negotiators. Entire teams vanished while the angel waited for my answer. I'd love to tell you I accepted because I wanted to save humanity. That would sound heroic, but it would also be complete nonsense. The truth is, I was terrified. Everyone else was already dead. The mission was over. The expedition had failed. The only thing I'd accomplished was becoming slightly more interesting than the thousands of corpses frozen into the walls around me. The angel didn't value me. It wasn't choosing me. I was just the newest thing in existence that hadn't become boring yet. Unfortunately, that was still a much better position than everyone else's. Maybe refusing would have saved the world. Maybe accepting doomed it. I didn't know. What I did know was that I wasn't ready to die in a hole beneath Antarctica, so I made the only decision that benefited the person I cared about most. Myself. Okay, I said. I agree. Just make it stop. The world turned white. When I woke up, I was inside the aircraft. The engines were running. The autopilot was already returning us home. The seats around me were empty. No soldiers, no negotiators, no pilots. The angel had never accepted my terms. It had offered its own. As soon as I returned this afternoon, I found myself standing before the board of directors trying to explain why I was the only survivor. What happened there, Agent Nairi? Madame Lenny's voice cut through the silence. All 8 board members, including Stonehill, were staring at me. It was an angel. The room immediately became tense. Several directors inhaled sharply. Others exchanged nervous glances. They're all dead, I continued, but in return, the angel accepted our terms. Several directors visibly relaxed. The agreement isn't permanent, I added. The relief vanished instantly. Not permanent? What do you mean, Agent? Madame Lenny asked. I swallowed. I think only the angel can explain it. Then the conference room doors opened. Every head turned. A young man stepped inside. Dark hair, perfect smile, eyes that seemed far too bright. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The young man looked around the room, his smile widening as he took in the expression staring back at him. Then he tilted his head slightly. Someone promised me that you all would keep me entertained. His gaze drifted across the conference table. For a moment, he looked almost disappointed. I suppose we'll find out if she was telling the truth. Now, if you're wondering, yes, he came back with me. I know what I said earlier. The aircraft was empty when I woke up. It was. There were no pilots, no negotiators, no soldiers. I never said there were no angels. Looking back, it's probably a good thing CSP decided to save money and remove the pilot. Explaining why I'd returned to the aircraft with no crew, and a perfectly healthy man wearing normal clothes in sub-zero temperatures would have raised some uncomfortable questions. So that's how I ended up with a new boss. Funny how life works. One day you're trying not to die beneath Antarctica. The next, you're apparently an assistant employed to entertain an immoral cosmic horror older than civilization. Although assistant probably isn't the right title. If he's the boss of Stonehill, then technically we are all assistants. The way I see it, humanity didn't stop an extinction event beneath Antarctica. We negotiated a performance review, and eventually, every audience gets bored. Part 3. Jacob returned 3 weeks later, and he was pissed. I was sitting in the cafeteria enjoying what was supposed to be a peaceful lunch break when the doors slammed open, hard enough to make half the room jump. Jacob walked in covered in scratches, mosquito bites, and what I sincerely hoped was mud. The Congo mission had apparently gone badly. From what I'd heard, he'd spent part of it wrestling a lion after it wandered into their camp. Then his team got eaten alive by mosquitoes before they even reached the god. After that, they still had to negotiate with the thing. Honestly, it sounded exhausting. Unfortunately, the moment Jacob spotted me, I knew exactly where all that frustration was going. I had enough time to think, oh no, before my sandwich disappeared. 1 second it was in my hand, the next it was flying across the cafeteria. Then I was flying across the cafeteria. Jacob grabbed me by the collar and hurled me over a table. I hit the floor hard enough to reconsider several life choices. "What the hell?" I shouted. Several employees immediately stood up and started leaving. Nobody gets involved when managers start fighting. It's one of the unspoken workplace safety policies everyone follows. "We had a deal, Nairi." He looked genuinely furious. Jacob normally had the complexion of a corpse. Somehow, he'd managed to turn bright red. It was honestly impressive. "Sean is still alive," I said. "Yeah, on paper." "Paper is what determines whether he's alive. You and I both know he's only classified as alive because he's physically inside the facility." "That still sounds alive." Jacob looked like he wanted to throw me across another table. "The report says you shoved him." "I did." "You shoved him toward a god." "We were negotiating." "You used him as a sacrifice." I climbed back to my feet and stared at my ruined lunch. The sandwich had done nothing wrong. That's a very loaded word. "Nairi." "What?" "You shoved an assistant into a supernatural entity." "And?" For a moment, Jacob stared at me. I sighed. "Look, I didn't know the god was going to keep him. I don't even know what was in the contract. None of us know the ancient language. For all I know, the contract could have included a section about complimentary assistance." Jacob opened his mouth. "That's not the point." "It kind of is. The point is Sean is walking in circles on floor 45, chanting at walls." I shrugged. The god did something outside the agreement, outside standard procedure, and outside my knowledge, which means that this is a containment problem, not a Nairi problem. The surrounding cafeteria had gone completely silent. Jacob looked genuinely conflicted because, unfortunately for him, I had a point. A terrible point. A morally questionable point, but still a point. "I hate you," Jacob said. "That's fair." Then he grabbed my backup sandwich off the table and started walking away. This was such a bad start to the week. Jacob had stolen my backup sandwich, thrown me across a table, and somehow managed to make Sean's situation sound like my fault. I picked up my tray and dumped what remained of my lunch into the trash. 3 weeks had passed since Antarctica. 3 weeks since I'd brought an angel back to the facility. Yes, everyone knows about him now. That had somehow become my problem too. I was halfway through mentally drafting a complaint to Human Resources when the cafeteria went silent. Not normal silent. Not coworkers watching two managers argue silent. The kind of silence that makes you immediately think, "Oh, for the love of God, what now?" Jacob stopped dead in his tracks. The anger drained from his face so fast it was almost impressive. His eyes moved past me towards something behind me. Around us, employees started standing up. A few lowered their heads. One woman dropped her tray, and nobody moved to pick it up. The entire room had suddenly become very interested in not attracting attention. I sighed. I already knew what that meant. I turned around and immediately understood the problem. The angel was standing in the doorway. He looked the same as he had in Antarctica. Tall, pale, perfect. The kind of face ancient civilizations would have carved into mountains and then started wars over. He was wearing a CSP employee badge. I don't know why that bothered me more than anything else. The badge even had a photo. And a name. Angelo. Which was probably the most angel name an angel could possibly have. Someone had apparently convinced an eldritch celestial entity to sit still for an identification photo, fill out employee paperwork, and accept a name badge. Or maybe he'd requested one himself. I wasn't sure which possibility was worse. For some reason, he'd developed a habit of appearing wherever I happened to be. Meetings, hallways, briefings, the gym, my apartment. I still wasn't sure how he'd found my apartment among the thousands of CSP apartments spread throughout the facility complex. That particular incident had resulted in several uncomfortable conversations with facility security. Apparently, security can't issue trespassing notices to ancient celestial entities capable of rewriting reality. As if that wasn't enough. I'd also developed strange scars running across my left leg. They'd appeared 3 days ago. The medical department had no idea what had caused them. Personally, I suspected the angel. At this point, blaming the angel had become my default explanation for most problems. The angel glanced around the room, looking curious and interested, like he was watching a peculiar educational documentary. Then his eyes landed on me. His expression immediately brightened. "Oh," he smiled. "There you are." I closed my eyes. Not because I was scared, because I was tired. Around me the cafeteria somehow became even quieter. Jacob slowly looked at me, then at the angel, then back at me. "Why is it always you?" he whispered. "I ask myself that every day." The angel started walking toward us. Everyone immediately moved out of his way. Nobody wanted to end up on the angel's list of hobbies. Unfortunately, I'd already lost that privilege. He stopped directly in front of me and stared for several seconds before tilting his head. "You are injured." I glanced at the bruise on my arm. "I'm aware." The angel followed my gaze. His eyes settled on Jacob. Jacob visibly tensed. Honestly, I couldn't blame him. The angel studied him for a moment before looking back at me. "Did he do that?" The entire cafeteria froze. Jacob stopped breathing. A few employees looked like they were preparing evacuation routes. "No." Jacob relaxed. "He only threw me across the table." Jacob immediately stopped relaxing. The angel blinked. "Oh." For several seconds he appeared to think about that. Then he turned toward Jacob and smiled. "Is this injury deadly to humans?" "No," I said. I was starting to get annoyed. The angel had a habit of asking questions like this. Over the past week, he'd asked enough questions to fill an entire library. Most of them were concerning. Some were merely annoying. A few had resulted in emergency meetings. How many bones can a human lose before it becomes a problem? Why do humans become upset when they are lied to? Can sadness be measured? Why do humans celebrate surviving another year? Why do humans enjoy horror stories? How much of a human can be removed before it affects productivity? How many employees can I duplicate before CSP notices? Those last two questions alone resulted in 3 emergency meetings, 4 containment reviews, and a facility-wide employee census. Then there were the questions directed specifically at me. Would you inform me before dying? If I prevented your death forever, would you still dislike me? Why do you become irritated when I watch you sleep? Those questions bothered me, not because I thought he was threatening me. The angel didn't really understand threats. The problem was that every question sounded genuine, like he was honestly trying to understand why the answers weren't obvious. And unfortunately, I had somehow become his preferred source of information. Or, as Stonehill liked to put it, his lab rat. That is good, the angel said. It would be inconvenient if you died. He pulled out a chair and sat beside the table Jacob had thrown me across. Nobody had invited him. Nobody was going to stop him. What are you doing? I asked. Eating lunch. You don't eat. I have been informed that lunch is a social activity. I stared at him. He stared back. The cafeteria remained completely silent. The angel glanced around the room. Have I interrupted something? Nobody answered. Good. Then he leaned down and picked up the remains of my sandwich from the floor. He examined it carefully, his brow furrowing. This appears damaged. I looked at the sandwich, then at him, then at Jacob. You owe me 2 sandwiches now. I sighed. My week had somehow gotten worse. That lunch break was the most awkward experience of my life. The angel spent 20 minutes learning how to chew. Not eating, chewing. Apparently he'd already understood the concept of consuming food. What fascinated him was the process of turning food into smaller pieces first. Jacob sat across from us, glaring at me the entire time like I'd personally unleashed this disaster onto humanity, which, in my defense, was only partially true. I inhaled my replacement sandwich in 3 bites just to escape. By the time I reached my office, I was already mentally preparing several complaints to HR that I knew nobody would read. Unfortunately, something was waiting on my desk. A report. I opened the folder. Missing 5,317 residents. Location: a small city in Nevada. Classification: B-class god. I stared at the report for several seconds before closing it. Then I opened it again. The number stubbornly remained the same. 5,000 people don't just disappear. At least they're not supposed to. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a briefing room explaining our plan to the B-class god under control. A B-class entity wasn't world-ending, but it was still more than capable of wiping out a city if left unattended. By the time the briefing ended, we had assembled a response team consisting of 400 security personnel, 6 negotiators, multiple research specialists, and enough equipment to invade a small country. Everything was proceeding normally, which should have been my first warning sign. We were already boarding the aircraft when I noticed movement near the loading ramp. I closed my eyes, counted to 5, then opened them again. The angel was still there. Of course he was. He stepped onto the plane like he belonged there. Several security officers immediately moved out of his way. One of the negotiators actually turned around and walked back down the ramp. I couldn't even blame him. What do you want? I asked. The angel looked genuinely surprised by the question. I wish to accompany you. It is boring here. This isn't a field trip. You said humans enjoy traveling. This isn't traveling. It appears to involve travel. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Around us, nobody was speaking. Nobody was moving. Nobody was volunteering to tell an eldritch celestial entity that he couldn't board the aircraft. The angel tilted his head. I am coming anyway. I sighed. Unfortunately, that wasn't really a statement I could argue with. Technically, I outranked most people in the organization except the board members. Practically nobody outranked an ancient celestial horror capable of rearranging reality whenever it got curious. 10 minutes later, we were airborne. The seating arrangement was interesting. By interesting, I mean everyone had crammed themselves onto the opposite side of the aircraft. 400 trained security personnel, 6 negotiators, and multiple researchers were all squeezed together like terrified sardines. Meanwhile, Angelo sat beside me with an entire row of seats empty around him. It looked less like transportation and more like a quarantine zone. The angel seemed completely unaware of this, or worse, completely aware and enjoying it. He stared out the aircraft window for several minutes before speaking. "Will this god be entertaining?" I looked up from my mission briefing. I'd prefer if it wasn't. "Why?" "Because entertaining gods usually kill people." He considered that for a moment. "Humans seem very opposed to being killed." I stared at him. "That's a groundbreaking observation." "Thank you." The fact that he wasn't being sarcastic somehow made it worse. I returned to my report, but I couldn't shake the feeling that bringing him along was going to become a problem. A very large problem. And considering our mission already involved 5,000 missing people and a hostile god, that was saying something. The flight lasted 4 hours, and they were 4 very long hours. At some point I fell asleep, which turned out to be a mistake. I woke up because someone was staring at me, not in a normal way, not in the creepy coworker way. I mean, directly staring at me from 6 inches away. I opened my eyes and nearly launched myself through the ceiling. The angel was sitting beside me, leaning forward and watching me with intense concentration. What the hell? Several nearby security officers jumped. The angel, meanwhile, looked pleased. "You make unusual noises when sleeping." I rubbed my face. People do that. "You stopped breathing 12 times. That's called snoring." "You appeared to be dying." I wasn't. The angel nodded thoughtfully. "You are weird." "Thank you." I was so annoyed I briefly considered throwing myself out of the aircraft just to end the conversation. He sat back unbothered by my expression. Across the cabin, dozens of employees immediately relaxed. Apparently, everyone had been waiting to see whether I was about to be dissected. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence, which should have worried me. Whenever things become quiet around the angel, it usually meant he was thinking, and whenever he was thinking, someone ended up filing paperwork. Lots of paperwork. We landed just before sunset. The city looked normal from the outside, and that was what bothered me. It was just a normal Nevada city sitting in the desert, peaceful, quiet, and empty. The moment we entered the city limits, I knew something was wrong. There were cars parked in driveways, lights still on inside homes, food sitting on restaurant tables, and a school bus abandoned in the middle of an intersection. It looked like the entire population had simply stood up and walked away. Nobody spoke as our convoy rolled through the streets. 400 security personnel suddenly seemed inadequate. Eventually we stopped in the center of town and I climbed out of the vehicle. The silence hit immediately. There were no birds, no insects, no wind, nothing. A city wasn't supposed to sound like that. One of the researchers approached carrying a tablet. "We found where it started." "Where?" "The church." Quite fitting for a god, honestly. Then again, gods could be anywhere. One time we found one underneath the Paris catacombs, so a church was comparatively normal. The church stood at the edge of town, small, white, and completely ordinary. Security teams established a perimeter, while researchers unloaded equipment. The angel wandered past all of them. Nobody tried stopping him. A few people actively moved out of his path. He stared at the church for several seconds before frowning. That immediately got my attention because the angel rarely frowned. "What?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the sky, then the church, then the empty streets. His expression became strangely uncomfortable. "I know this one." The way he said it made my stomach drop. We are currently outside the church waiting for the final breach order. The angel hasn't taken his eyes off the building since he arrived. I've seen him curious. I've seen him confused. I've seen him amused. This is the first time I've ever seen him look concerned. If I'm being honest, that's making me consider several alternative career paths. Anyway, they're calling us in. I'll update this journal if I survive whatever is waiting inside. Part 4. Final part. I survived. I realize now that survival and success are not remotely the same thing. Looking back, I should have taken the angel's concerns more seriously. "You know the God?" "Yes." That was not reassuring, not even slightly. The angel looked at the church the same way someone might look at a former co-worker they absolutely hated. "That is unfortunate." I stared at him. What does that mean? He was quiet for several moments before smiling, and somehow that was even worse. "It means your chances of survival have decreased significantly." Nobody laughed. The angel seemed genuinely confused by this reaction. Then he raised one hand and pointed toward the church. "It is one of the gods that believe it could imprison me." For the first time since Antarctica, genuine excitement entered his voice. The smile on his face widened, and widened, and widened, until it stretched from ear to ear. Several security officers instinctively stepped backward. I couldn't blame them. The expression wasn't human. It wasn't even close. "Why are you smiling?" I asked. Honestly, I just wanted him to stop. The angel's eyes remained fixed on the church. "Do you believe in heaven?" I blinked. "What?" "Heaven," he repeated. "Do you believe humans go there after death?" I stared at him. I had no idea why he was asking that. Maybe it was because we were standing in front of a church, or because he didn't think we were going to survive. Then again, most of what he did made absolutely no sense, at least not to humans. "Why would I?" I asked. The angel blinked. "Why would you not?" I shrugged. "All the gods I've met live on Earth. If they're here, who's in heaven?" To my surprise, the angel laughed. Not loudly, just enough to make me immediately uncomfortable. "You are intelligent," he said. "I've been told otherwise." His smile widened slightly. How far can his face actually stretch? "If humans do not go to heaven, where do you think souls go when they die?" Thought about it for a moment. The honest answer wasn't particularly complicated. "I don't know." The angel waited. "If I had to guess, somewhere maybe. That's usually how religions explain it." I had never been particularly religious, much to my parents' disappointment. The angel tilted his head. "They do not." I frowned. "What?" "When humans die, their souls dissipate and cease to exist." He said it with the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather. Suddenly everything felt very quiet. I stared at him. The angel stared back. Around us, security teams prepared equipment, checked weapons, and finalized entry plans, completely unaware that the angel had just casually informed me that the afterlife wasn't real. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I shrugged. "Okay." "Yeah." "You do not seem upset." "Should I be?" The angel studied me carefully. "Most humans react poorly to that information." I was genuinely too tired for this conversation. "Why?" "Because they fear death." "That sounds like a future me problem." The angel stared. I continued. "If I'm dead, I really can't do anything about it." The silence stretched. Slowly, the angel leaned forward. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely baffled. You are remarkably unconcerned about your own mortality despite repeatedly surviving situations that should kill you. I shrugged. Being concerned about death won't stop death. Everybody dies eventually. The angel continued staring at me. I had the distinct feeling I'd given the wrong answer, or possibly the most interesting answer. Unfortunately, with him, those were usually the same thing. Finally, the preparations were complete. We made our way toward the church entrance. Security teams established positions around the building. After a brief discussion that mostly consisted of people arguing over who had to go in first, the security personnel breached the doors. The moment they swung open, every conversation died. The church was bigger. Much bigger. Not slightly bigger or architecturally impressively bigger. Impossibly bigger. The interior stretched far beyond what the exterior dimensions should have allowed. Rows upon rows of pews extended into the distance, disappearing into a dim golden haze. Hundreds of civilians filled those seats. Then I realized it wasn't hundreds. It was thousands. Every missing resident was there. 5,000 people sat perfectly still in neat rows as if a church service was underway. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They simply stared forward with peaceful expressions on their faces. The sight would have been comforting if it weren't so deeply wrong. At the far end of the impossible sanctuary stood a massive figure. At first I thought it was a statue. Then it moved. The thing towered over the congregation. Its body partially fused into the floor beneath it. Thick roots, or maybe veins, spread outward from its lower half, disappearing through the stone as if the church itself had grown around it. Its head resembled that of a goat, crowned with twisting horns, while its body was covered in dark feathers like some grotesque bird. Human hands protruded from the mass of feathers, pressed together in prayer. The entire thing looked wrong, not horrifying in the traditional sense, just bizarre in a way that made my brain struggle to process what it was seeing. Its enormous hands remained clasped together as thousands of worshippers mirrored the pose. Every missing resident knelt in perfect silence, staring toward the thing at the front of the church. Thousands of people praying, thousands of people worshipping, and at the center of it all sat a god. "Why are you here, human?" Its voice echoed through the sanctuary despite the fact it hadn't raised it. 5,000 heads remained perfectly still. I stepped forward before anyone else could. "We have a proposition. Humans are going to notice that an entire city disappeared. We can help you keep your current worshippers, but you need to cooperate." The god tilted its head. "Or?" I sighed. "Please understand. If the government discovers what's happening here, they'll eventually respond by removing the problem." That wasn't technically true. The government wasn't the problem. We were. CSP generally handled situations like this. If a god refused our agreements, we didn't negotiate forever. We erased the problem from the map. The god's expression darkened. "Remove?" They wiped the entire location off the map. A long silence followed. Then the god blinked. "I see." Surprisingly, it didn't seem particularly concerned. Its gaze drifted past me, past the security teams, past the researchers, past everyone. Then it froze. The change was immediate. Its pupils widened. The feathers along its body puffed outward. For the first time since we'd entered the church, the god looked genuinely afraid. "Wait, is that—" A voice answered before I could. "Yes, it's me." The angel stepped forward. For the first time since entering the church, the congregation reacted. Thousands of worshippers shifted uneasily. The god stared. The angel stared back. Recognition flashed across both their faces. Then the god's expression twisted into horror. Unfortunately, the god recognized that smile. "And I remember you." The angel's grin widened. The smile on his face was entirely wrong for the situation. The god recoiled. For a moment, I forgot that I was looking at a god. Fear is a remarkably universal expression, and whatever history existed between these two, the god wanted absolutely no part of it. The deity surged to its feet. Roots tore free from the stone floor with sounds like breaking bones as it rose to its full height. "What have you done, you fools? You let him here." The entire church shook. Thousands of worshippers suddenly stood all at once. 5,000 people moved in perfect synchronization. My stomach dropped. This is bad. The crowd surged toward us. Security personnel immediately formed defensive layers around the negotiators, researchers, and medical teams. Training took over. Orders were shouted. Rifles came up. Then the first wave hit. Gunfire erupted throughout the church. The sound was deafening. Hundreds of rifles opened fire simultaneously as the congregation rushed forward like a living tidal wave. Bullets tore through pews and shattered stained glass windows. People screamed. Radios exploded with overlapping orders. The worshippers didn't stop. They just kept coming. And through all of it, the angel stood there smiling at the god, like he'd finally found something interesting. None of this matters anymore. The mission had changed. Negotiation was over. Containment was over. Now we were moving to demolition. I pushed through the chaos toward the altar, clutching the demolition charge against my chest. The device wasn't much larger than a backpack, but it carried enough firepower to bring down a building if placed correctly. Unfortunately, there were several thousand extremely motivated civilians between me and where I needed to put it. I shot at the civilians. I'm not proud of that. I'm also not dead. Unfortunately, those were the only two options available at the time. Security personnel fought desperately to hold the crowd back, while I slipped through gaps in the fighting. A woman grabbed my arm. I fired. A man lunged at me from between the pews. I fired again. Somebody tackled one of our researchers to the floor, and I fired a third time. I didn't stop moving. Stopping was how you died. By the time I reached the front rows, my ears were ringing from gunfire, and my lungs felt like they were on fire. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and burning gunpowder. The god saw me immediately. Of course it did. Its massive head turned toward me as I sprinted between shattered pews. Around us, gunfire echoed through the impossible sanctuary, while thousands of worshippers surged through the defensive line. Somewhere behind me, security teams were still trying to prevent the situation from becoming even worse. They were failing. The charge suddenly felt very small, and the god suddenly felt very large. Behind me, the security teams were buying time with bullets. Ahead of me sat an angry deity, and somewhere to my left, the angel was laughing, not helping, just laughing, which somehow made the situation even worse. I reached the base of the altar and dropped to one knee. My hands were already moving, pulling the charge free, arming it, and setting the timer. For one glorious second, I thought I might actually pull this off. Then the god moved. One moment it was 20 feet away. The next, a massive hand filled my vision. I threw myself sideways. The hand slammed into the floor where I'd been standing. The impact sounded like a car crash. Stone exploded outward as the shock wave hit me like a truck. I lost my footing and flew across the sanctuary. The last thing I saw before impact was the demolition charge sliding from my hands. Then I hit a wall. Hard. The stone cracked around me. Something inside my shoulder made a noise shoulders aren't supposed to make. For several seconds I couldn't breathe. I slid to the floor in a shower of dust and broken masonry, while pain shot through every part of my body. Everything rang. My ears, my head, my teeth, the entire world. Through blurred vision, I spotted the charge lying near the god's roots. Still armed, still ticking. The god saw it too. "Eat dirt," I muttered. Then the explosion detonated. The blast lit up the sanctuary like a second sun. The shock wave ripped through the church. Stone pillars shattered, stained glass vaporized. Entire sections of the floor erupted upward. The god let out a sound somewhere between a scream and a roar as fire engulfed the altar. Then gravity remembered its job. The ceiling began to collapse. Chunks of stone the size of cars tore free overhead. Cracks raced across the impossible sanctuary as the entire structure groaned around us. People screamed. The remaining worshippers scattered. Security teams threw themselves behind whatever cover they could find. I managed exactly one thought. Is this how it ends? Then several tons of debris came crashing down on top of me. Everything vanished in a flash of light. For a moment, I was certain I was dead. Then I opened my eyes. I was standing in the middle of a field. Tall grass stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and above me the sky shimmered gold and silver, filled with stars that drifted across the heavens far too quickly to belong to any real night. There was no church, no gunfire, and no screaming. There was only silence and the god. The goat-headed deity stood several yards away, motionless among the grass. Its enormous form seemed different somehow, less solid, less real, as though I was looking at a reflection instead of the thing itself. I stared at it, looked around, and then looked back at it. What the? The god inclined its head. Hello, human. The deity's feathers rustled despite the absence of wind. You stand at the edge of a doorway. Your body remains elsewhere. That explained absolutely nothing. Am I dead? No. Oh. The god seemed disappointed by how calmly I accepted that answer. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then it stepped closer. You travel beside a dangerous thing. I immediately knew who it meant. The angel? The god's expression darkened. I waited, and eventually it spoke again. When the first voice shaped the world, every star, every god, and every living thing was given a name. I frowned. Okay. Most names are forgotten. Its gaze settled upon me. Some should remain forgotten. The grass bent around us as though something vast had shifted beneath the earth. Then the god recited, Before the throne and before the sky, before the first star learned to fly, a voice bestowed both fate and seal, a word no servant may repeal. Find that word and make it real, and even heaven's hounds must kneel. The field fell silent. I waited. The god waited. What does that mean? The deity blinked. The one you call angel wears many names, but only one was given. Something about the way it was said made my stomach tighten. The stars above began to fracture as thin cracks spread across the sky. The field around us started to dissolve, and the god's voice echoed through the growing darkness. Find the name spoken by its creator, and even the oldest servant must listen. The world split apart around us. I stared at the deity. Why are you helping me? For the first time, the god hesitated. The cracks widened, and the grass dissolved into drifting fragments of light before it finally answered. Because I remember what it was before it was given a purpose. The field shook beneath us. The god's eyes remained fixed on mine. And because some things should never be allowed power. The world shattered. The last thing I saw was the goat-headed deity staring directly at me before everything went dark. For a brief, glorious moment, there was nothing. No pain, no collapsing church, no angry gods, and no angel. Then consciousness returned, immediately followed by regret. I opened my eyes to the familiar sight of a hospital ceiling. Unfortunately, there was also a face approximately 6 inches from mine. At this point, I was beginning to suspect the angel simply materialized next to unconscious people for entertainment. Oh, he said. You survived." I stared at him. The angel stared back. Neither of us spoke for several seconds before I finally sighed. "Can you stop doing that?" "Doing what?" He leaned back slightly. "Not enough." My head was ringing, my vision was blurry, and every part of my body hurt. Breathing hurt, thinking hurt, existing hurt. The angel tilted his head. "Are all humans this weak, or are you the exception?" I closed my eyes. "Good morning to you too." He was silent for a moment before speaking again. "Why are you like this?" I opened one eye. "Why are you this interested in me?" The question came out more annoyed than intended. Then again, nearly dying probably gave a person the confidence to ask questions they normally wouldn't. The angel considered it. "You repeatedly place yourself in situations that should result in your death, despite possessing remarkably poor instincts." The room remained silent. I waited. Eventually he continued. "You are very fragile, yet you continue succeeding. I find this unusually entertaining." Of course he did. I am writing this from my hospital bed now. According to the doctors, I suffered a concussion, a dislocated shoulder, 3 fractured ribs, and enough bruising to qualify as modern art. Apparently, getting bruised beneath several tons of collapsing cement isn't recommended for long-term health. The angel is currently sitting across the room. For once, he isn't staring at me. Instead, he's staring out the window, and I have no idea why. A few minutes ago, he informed me that he intends to accompany me on future missions. Apparently, this was not a request. Normally, that would be the most concerning thing to happen all day. Instead, I keep thinking about what the god told me. The warning, the name, and the fear in its voice. The god wasn't afraid of us. It wasn't afraid of our weapons. It wasn't afraid of being blown apart. It was afraid of the angel. That should probably bother me more than it does. But what bothered me instead was something else. When I first met the angel, he felt completely alien. Not hostile, not friendly, just distant. Like a force of nature pretending to be a person. Now I'm not so sure. A few weeks ago he wouldn't have understood sarcasm. Now he uses it. Poorly, but he tries. When I first met him, he never asked questions. Now he asks them constantly. Most of them are deeply concerning, but they're still questions. The strangest part is that I think he's started lying. Not well and not often, but I've caught him doing it. Tiny things. Claiming he wasn't curious about something immediately before asking 27 follow-up questions. Insisting he doesn't care what people do before getting visibly annoyed when Jacob injured me. Pretending he wasn't waiting outside my hospital room after being told visitors weren't allowed. The lies are obvious. The fact that he tells them at all is not. The angel claims he does not experience human emotions. I believed him. Now I'm beginning to suspect he's trying to. I don't know why that possibility unsettles me. Maybe because I've met plenty of monsters pretending to be gods. Or maybe it's because the angel has started looking less like a force of nature and more like a person. If something older than time itself is learning how to be human, I have absolutely no idea what happens next. Humans trust each other eventually, though, and if he learns to trust, maybe one day he'll tell me his name. That thought should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified me. A dark possibility entered my mind. If the angel ever trusted me enough to give me his name, I knew exactly what I would do with it. I'd tell myself it was for humanity. I'd tell myself it was a safeguard, a weapon of last resort, something to use only if he ever became a threat. But deep down I knew the truth. I'd keep it because I'd finally have leverage over something stronger than me. For the first time in my life, I wouldn't be the fragile one in the room. The realization made my stomach turn. The god warned me that some things should never be allowed to have power. Looking at the angel now, I'm starting to think it wasn't talking about him. I think it was talking about me. The angel just asked why I was smiling at him. I wasn't aware I was. Considering I've spent the last 10 minutes figuring out how to blackmail an entity older than civilization, that's probably not a great sign. Anyway, if I don't update this journal again, I've either completed my mandatory counseling, or I'm having another terrible day babysitting an entity older than time itself, for an organization that shouldn't exist.